The phone call that changed my life came on a rainy Tuesday morning in April. "Mr. James Anderson passed away peacefully in his sleep," the lawyer said, his voice formal yet kind. "Your grandfather left you his cabin on Pine Lake." I sat in stunned silence. Grandpa James and I had been close when I was young, spending countless summers fishing from his wooden dock, but adult life and distance had separated us in recent years. The guilt of not visiting him more often washed over me, along with a profound sense of loss. 2 weeks later, I stood at the end of a gravel driveway, staring at what was now my property. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood: sturdy logs darkened with age, a wide covered porch facing the water, and windows that reflected the sparkling blue of Pine Lake. It was not fancy or modern by any means, but it held something more valuable than contemporary design: memories of learning to bait a hook, of late-night stories by the fireplace, of a man who taught me that patience and integrity mattered more than anything else. I walked slowly around the property, taking in the familiar sights. The massive oak tree still stood guard over the left side of the yard. The stone path my grandfather had laid by hand still wound its way down to the dock, but something felt different about the surroundings. Where there had once been similar modest cabins dotting the shoreline, now stood immaculate 2- and 3-story luxury homes with manicured lawns and private boat slips. After unpacking my small collection of belongings, I decided to take a walk along the shore. The springtime sun warmed my face as I strolled past neighboring properties. I noticed the sideways glances from homeowners tending their gardens or washing their expensive boats. One woman in tennis whites actually stopped her conversation mid-sentence to stare at me as I passed. Her companion whispered something, and they both laughed behind their hands. "Hello there," I called out with a friendly wave. The women nodded stiffly before turning their backs to me. Their message was clear: I did not belong here. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the gentle lapping of water against the shoreline. For the first time in years, the constant tension in my shoulders began to ease. This place could be my sanctuary, a retreat from the chaos of city life. I spent the day cleaning the cabin, opening windows to let in fresh air, and rediscovering childhood treasures tucked away in corners. As the sun began to set, I sat on the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the light play across the water. A sleek pontoon boat cruised by, filled with well-dressed people holding wine glasses. They fell silent as they passed my property, and I heard the words "such an eyesore" drift across the water. I pretended not to notice, keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon until they passed. When I returned to the cabin, I spotted an envelope that had been slipped through the mail slot in my door. The heavy cream-colored paper bore an embossed pine tree logo and the words "Pine Lake Homeowners Association" in elegant script. My stomach tightened as I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "Dear property owner," it began in cold, formal language. "It has come to our attention that your residence at 1457 Lakeshore Drive is in violation of multiple community standards as outlined in the Pine Lake HOA Covenant." The letter went on to list numerous deficiencies, including deteriorating exterior, unkempt landscaping, and outdated structural elements that detract from community aesthetic standards. I read through the extensive list of complaints with growing disbelief. The final paragraph stated that I had 30 days to address these issues or face fines of $200 per day. At the bottom was the signature of Karen Blackwell, HOA president, her name written in flowing, confident script. I stepped outside and looked at my cabin with new eyes. Yes, it was older and simpler than the surrounding showplaces. The dark wood exterior could use a fresh coat of sealant. The natural landscaping was not as manicured as the neighboring properties with their perfect rows of imported flowers. but it was clean, structurally sound, and held a rustic charm that these sterile mansions could never achieve. As night fell over the lake, I sat at my grandfather's old desk, reading through the HOA covenant that had been attached to the letter. The required renovations would cost tens of thousands of dollars, money I simply did not have. More importantly, these changes would strip away everything that made this place special. The simple cabin that had stood for generations would be transformed into a pale imitation of the surrounding cookie-cutter luxury homes. I placed the letter in a drawer and gazed out at the moonlight reflecting off the lake. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter and the clink of glasses from one of the large houses. I felt like an outsider in a place that had once been my second home. But underneath that feeling was something stronger: determination. This cabin was my inheritance, my connection to the past, and I was not about to give it up without a fight. 1 week after receiving the notice, I found myself walking into the Pine Lake Community Center for my first HOA meeting. The building was impressive: vaulted ceilings, marble floors, and a wall of windows overlooking the lake. I wore the best clothes I had brought with me, clean jeans and a button-down shirt, but I still felt underdressed compared to the other attendees in their business casual attire and designer labels. As I signed the attendance sheet, the woman behind the registration table looked me up and down. "Oh, you must be the new owner of the Anderson property," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How interesting that you decided to keep it rather than sell." I forced a smile. "It has sentimental value." She blinked slowly as if the concept was foreign to her. "Well, take a seat. We start promptly at 7. The meeting room was arranged with rows of chairs facing a long table where 5 board members sat reviewing papers. At precisely 7 o'clock, a slender woman with platinum blonde hair styled in a perfect bob tapped a gavel against a sound block. The room immediately fell silent. "Good evening, everyone. I am Karen Blackwell, your HOA president," she announced, her voice cultured and confident. "Before we begin our regular agenda, I would like to welcome a new face to our community." All heads turned in my direction. "We have the new owner of the old Anderson cabin with us tonight. Would you like to introduce yourself?" I stood awkwardly, feeling dozens of eyes examining me. "Hello, my name is Alex Anderson. James was my grandfather. I inherited the cabin and plan to live there full time." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "How lovely. We are certainly looking forward to seeing the improvements you will be making to bring the property up to community standards." Before I could respond, she moved on to other matters. For the next 45 minutes, I listened to discussions about landscaping contracts, the upcoming summer party budget, and complaints about unauthorized bird feeders. It was clear this community operated under strict rules that regulated nearly every aspect of homeownership. When new business was announced, a tall man with silver hair and a deep tan stood up. "Karen, if I may," he said in a booming voice that commanded attention, "I would like to address the condition of the Anderson property directly." Karen nodded. "The floor recognizes Richard Henderson, chair of our Architectural Review Committee." Richard turned to face the room, but his eyes locked onto mine. "As most of you know, our community has worked diligently over the past decade to elevate Pine Lake to one of the most prestigious addresses in the county. Property values have increased by 63%, largely due to our strict adherence to aesthetic standards." He clicked a remote, and suddenly images of my cabin appeared on a large screen at the front of the room. The photos were clearly taken to emphasize every flaw: a loose shutter, peeling paint on the dock, the natural but unmanicured landscaping. "This," he said, gesturing dramatically toward the screen, is what potential buyers and visitors see when they drive past. This single property is diminishing all of our home values and undermining years of community effort. I felt my face growing hot as neighbors turned to stare at me. A woman a few seats away actually moved to leave an empty chair between us. Richard continued, "The Architectural Review Committee recommends immediate action. The owner should be required to replace the cedar shake roof with approved architectural shingles, repaint the exterior in an approved color scheme, replace the dock with a modern composite structure, and install proper landscaping that meets community guidelines." Karen nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Richard. The board has already issued initial notice of violations. We are giving the owner 30 days to submit improvement plans and begin work." She looked directly at me. Though given the extensive nature of the required renovations, that timeline may be challenging. "Impossible is more like it," I said under my breath. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses spoke up from the board table. "Perhaps we should discuss the community purchase option again. It would be the simplest solution for everyone involved." Richard nodded enthusiastically. "Excellent point, Howard. The Finance Committee has set aside funds specifically for this purpose. We could make a fair offer and incorporate that land into the community shoreline project." I stood up, unable to remain silent any longer. "Excuse me, but the cabin is not for sale. It was my grandfather's home for over 40 years, and now it is mine. I understand your concerns about appearances, but I cannot afford the extensive renovations you are demanding, certainly not on your timeline." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Karen cleared her throat. "I understand this may seem overwhelming, but these standards were established for the good of the entire community. Everyone else has managed to comply." "Everyone else lives in homes built within the last decade," I countered. "My cabin predates your HOA by at least 30 years. Richard stepped forward. "Which is precisely why it no longer fits here. Times change, property values increase, and standards rise accordingly. If you cannot afford to maintain the property appropriately, perhaps this is not the right place for you." Several members nodded in agreement. I looked around the room, searching for a sympathetic face but finding none. Karen tapped her gavel. "We will proceed as planned. 30 days to submit renovation plans and begin work, or daily fines will commence. Now, moving on to the next agenda item, preparations for the annual fishing tournament." I remained in my seat, clutching the armrests to steady myself as the conversation shifted to the tournament. Richard became animated as he discussed prime fishing locations along the shoreline. "The North Cove has produced our biggest catches for 3 years running," he boasted. "My team has already begun scouting the best spots. With the improvements we have made to the shoreline access, this year should be our best tournament yet." I noticed several members glancing in my direction as they discussed shoreline access near my property. One woman whispered to her companion, who shook his head and chuckled. I had the distinct feeling I was missing something important. When the meeting finally adjourned, I collected the thick packet of violation notices left on my chair. As people filed out, I overheard Richard speaking to a small group. "The fishing rights along that stretch are too valuable to leave in the hands of someone who does not appreciate them," he said. "One way or another, that eyesore will be gone by tournament time." I walked back to my cabin under a star-filled sky, the weight of the violation packet heavy in my hands. Their tactics were clear: make compliance impossible, force me out through fines I could not pay, then acquire the property for their community project. But something Richard said about fishing rights kept nagging at me. My grandfather had been passionate about protecting his stretch of shoreline. There had to be records somewhere that would clarify exactly what I owned. That night, I made a plan. Before surrendering to their demands or their offers, I needed to understand exactly what my inheritance entailed. Tomorrow, I would visit the county record's office and find out what secrets might be hidden in the property's history. The county records office occupied the basement level of an imposing government building in the center of town. The air inside smelled of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner. A bored-looking clerk glanced up from her computer as I approached the counter. "I need to research property boundaries for a lakefront parcel," I explained. "It is on Pine Lake, originally purchased in the 1970s by James Anderson." She pointed me toward a bank of ancient computers. "Start with the digital index for anything after 1990. For older records, you will need the physical archives." She handed me a visitor badge. "Archives are through that door. Sign the logbook when you enter." The archives room was dimly lit and lined with metal shelves holding hundreds of large bound volumes and flat file drawers. A white-haired man sat at a desk in the corner, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "First-time researcher?" he asked as I signed the logbook. I nodded, looking for property records from the 1970s, Pine Lake area. He stood up with surprising agility. "Pine Lake, you say? Interesting history there. Used to be all vacation cabins before the development boom." He pulled several heavy volumes from different shelves. "Start with these plat maps and deed registries. What is the name?" "Anderson, James Anderson." Recognition flickered across his face. Old James Anderson had that nice cabin on the north side. "That was my grandfather. He passed away recently." The archivist shook his head. "Sorry to hear that. Good man, your grandfather. One of the few who held onto his place when the developers came calling." He pulled another book from a high shelf. "You might want to look at this one too, the original survey from when the lake properties were first parceled out." For hours, I pored over maps and legal descriptions, comparing property boundaries across decades of records. The cabin itself sat on a modest half-acre lot, exactly as I had expected. But as I traced the history of the property through successive documents, something unexpected emerged. My grandfather had made a second purchase in 1978, a separate transaction that did not appear in the more recent records. I called the archivist over. "There seems to be a discrepancy. This deed from 1978 shows my grandfather purchasing an additional lakefront parcel adjacent to his cabin property, but it does not show up in the newer records." The old man leaned over the documents, squinting through his glasses. "Let me see. Ah, here is your problem. When they digitized the records, they sometimes missed connected parcels if they were filed under separate deed numbers. This second purchase was significant, nearly a quarter-mile of undeveloped shoreline extending north from your cabin." My heart began to race. So this shoreline is still part of my inheritance. "According to these records, absolutely. Unless your grandfather sold it, which I do not recall him doing." He pulled out an official-looking form. "What you need is a proper survey based on the original property descriptions. That will establish the current boundaries definitively." I thanked him and gathered the most relevant documents to make copies. As I waited for the ancient copy machine to warm up, I spread out the original plat map on a nearby table. The undeveloped shoreline that extended from my property was exactly where the most popular fishing spots were located, where Richard Henderson had been so confidently planning the tournament. With a stack of copies in hand, I stepped outside the government building. Across the street was a law office with a sign reading "Martinez and Associates, Property Law Specialists." On impulse, I crossed the street and pushed open the door. The receptionist looked up from her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I was hopping to speak with someone about a property boundary issue. It is somewhat urgent." She was about to respond when a door opened and a woman in her 40s with dark-rimmed glasses and a neat bun emerged. "I heard property boundary issue," she said. "That happens to be my specialty. Elena Martinez." She extended her hand. "Alex Anderson," I replied, shaking her hand. "I have just discovered some unusual information about my property on Pine Lake." Her eyebrows raised slightly. "Pine Lake, interesting. I have handled several cases there recently." She gestured toward her office. "I have 15 minutes before my next appointment. Show me what you found." In her office, I spread out the copies of the deeds and maps. Elena studied them with practiced efficiency. "Based on these documents," she said after several minutes, "you own considerably more land than what is commonly recognized as your property. The parcel includes not just the cabin lot but also this entire stretch of undeveloped shoreline." She traced her finger along the boundary line. "Has anyone been using this land without your permission?" I explained about the HOA, the violation notices, and the fishing tournament discussions. Elena sat back in her chair, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "So they have no idea you own the very shoreline they have been using for their prestigious tournament. And meanwhile, they are trying to force you out with violation notices." I nodded. "This is quite the situation." She checked her watch. "My next client will be here soon, but I would like to take your case. We need to get an official survey done immediately to establish the current boundary markers. Once we have that, we can address both the HOA harassment and the unauthorized use of your property." As I left her office with a contract and a plan, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. Through the window of a coffee shop across the street, I spotted Richard Henderson meeting with several men in business suits. They were gathered around a table looking at what appeared to be development plans. I ducked out of sight before they could notice me, but not before I saw Richard pointing to a location on the map that I strongly suspected was my shoreline. Back at the cabin that evening, I sat on the dock watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and gold. My phone chimed with another text message from the HOA, a reminder that 23 days remained to address the violations before fines would begin. I smiled to myself, thinking of the expression that would cross Karen Blackwell's face when she discovered the truth about my property. From my position on the dock, I could see a group of men with fishing rods making their way along their shoreline. Richard Henderson's distinctive silver hair gleamed in the fading light as he pointed out spots to his companions, completely unaware he was trespassing on my land. For the first time since receiving that first HOA letter, I felt the tide beginning to turn. My grandfather had left me more than just a cabin. He had left me the means to stand my ground against those who would bully me out of my home. I thought of his favorite saying, "Patience is not just waiting, it is waiting with the right bait on your hook." I now had the perfect bait. I just needed to set the hook at exactly the right moment. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the gravel driveway into a muddy path and filling the lake to its highest level of the spring. I sat at the kitchen table sorting through my growing collection of HOA notices. The most recent one had arrived yesterday, a formal notification of impending fines with an itemized list of all 23 violations I had failed to address. I glanced out the window and froze. Through the raindrops streaming down the glass, I could make out several figures standing at the edge of my property line. Karen Blackwell was clearly recognizable in her red raincoat, pointing toward my cabin while talking to a man in a suit who was taking notes. Behind them stood Richard Henderson, and two other people I recognized from the HOA board meeting. I slipped on my raincoat and boots and stepped onto the porch. They immediately noticed me watching them. Instead of looking embarrassed at being caught, Karen waved with exaggerated friendliness and began walking toward my cabin. The others followed behind her like an entourage. "Alex, terrible weather we are having," she called out as if we were old friends. "We were just discussing the community improvement project. Do you have a moment to chat?" I reluctantly motioned them onto the covered porch. They crowded under the roof, water dripping from their expensive raincoats onto the wooden boards. The man in the suit extended his hand. "David Mercer, Lakefront Developers," he said. "You have quite a unique property here." "Thank you," I replied coolly. "May I ask what brings all of you to my property in this downpour?" Karen stepped forward. "We wanted to discuss options with you directly. The deadline for addressing the violations is approaching, and frankly, we are concerned about your ability to complete the necessary improvements." Richard cleared his throat. "The board has authorized me to present you with an offer." He pulled an envelope from inside his jacket. "We are prepared to purchase your property for 20% above the county assessed value. This would allow you to avoid the impending fines and find a more suitable living arrangement." I accepted the envelope but did not open it. "And what would happen to my cabin?" David Mercer smiled broadly. "We have exciting plans for this entire section of Shoreline. Luxury condominiums with private boat slips, a community pavilion, improved fishing access. Your property is the missing piece in our development vision." "I see," I said, feeling anger rise in my chest. "So you have already made plans for my land." Karen touched my arm with false sympathy. "Alex, be reasonable. The fines will begin in less than 2 weeks. At $200 per day, how long can you realistically hold out? This offer is generous and allows everyone to move forward positively." I stepped back from her touch. "I will consider your offer and respond formally through appropriate channels. Now if you will excuse me, I have work to do." Their smiles faded at my dismissal. Richard's face hardened. "Do not take too long. This offer has an expiration date." After they left, I watched through the window as they huddled under umbrellas at the edge of my property, still discussing their plans as if my refusal was merely a temporary setback. I tossed their unopened offer onto the stack of violation notices and picked up my phone to call Elena Martinez. That night, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper when I returned from grocery shopping. The paper was damp from the rain, but the message was clear: "Sell now or regret later." The childish anonymity of the threat might have been laughable if it did not feel so personally invasive. Over the next week, the harassment intensified. Neighbors who had previously just ignored me now openly glared or made comments as I walked past. "There goes our property values," one woman stage whispered to her husband. A group of teenage boys rode their bikes repeatedly past my cabin, calling out "dump" and "tear down" before speeding away laughing. One morning, I discovered that someone had thrown eggs at my front door during the night. As I was cleaning up the mess, a sleek silver Mercedes pulled into my driveway. Karen Blackwell emerged, dressed impeccably in a powder blue pantsuit. "Oh my," she said, observing the egg residue with exaggerated concern. "It seems someone is expressing their frustration with your property. Children, most likely." "Did you need something, Karen?" I asked, continuing to scrub the door. She sighed dramatically. "I wanted to check if you had considered our offer. The board met last night, and I convinced them to give you a slight extension on the renovation deadline. We really do want to be reasonable." "That is very thoughtful," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. Karen moved closer, lowering her voice confidentially. "Between us, Alex, things will only get more difficult if you continue to resist. The community has resources you cannot match. Legal battles are expensive and time-consuming. Why put yourself through that stress when you could walk away with a profit?" "Is that a threat?" She laughed lightly. "Of course not. Just friendly advice from someone who has seen this situation before. Previous holdouts did not fare well." She handed me her business card. "Call me when you are ready to be reasonable. We have already shown the property to 3 potential developers who are very interested." After she left, I stood on my porch watching her car disappear down the road. The casual mention of showing my property to developers without my knowledge or permission filled me with cold anger. I pulled out my phone and called Elena Martinez. "They are escalating their tactics," I told her when she answered. "Anonymous threats, property vandalism, and now I learn they have been showing my land to developers." "Document everything," Elena replied firmly. "Take photos of any damage, save all written communications, and record any interactions if legally possible. I have good news. The survey team will be out tomorrow to mark your actual property lines. Once we have that official documentation, we will file for a cease and desist regarding both the harassment and the unauthorized use of your shoreline." The next morning, I watched from my window as the survey team worked methodically along the lakeshore, consulting their instruments and placing temporary markers. Several neighbors came out to observe, clearly confused by activity on what they had long considered community property. By mid-afternoon, Richard Henderson arrived with 2 other HOA board members. They approached the survey team leader, gesturing angrily toward the markers. I grabbed my phone and walked down to join them. "Is there a problem?" I asked calmly. Richard turned to me, his face flushed. "What do you think you are doing? This is community access shoreline. You have no authority to survey here." The survey team leader, a woman in her 50s with gray hair tucked under a company cap, stepped forward. "Actually, sir, we are conducting an official property survey at the request of the legal owner." She nodded toward me. "According to the original deeds and county records, this entire shoreline section belongs to the Anderson property." The blood drained from Richard's face. "That is impossible. This area has been used by the community for decades." "Usage does not confer ownership," the surveyor replied matter-of-factly. "The legal boundaries are quite clear in the original documents." One of the other board members pulled Richard aside, whispering urgently. I could catch phrases like "check the records" and "before the tournament." That evening, after the survey team had placed the last temporary marker and departed, I sat on my dock watching the sunset. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the orange and pink sky like a mirror. I noticed movement in the trees to my right and raised my phone discreetly, activating the camera. Through the zoom, I could clearly see Richard Henderson and 3 other men setting up fishing gear along my newly marked shoreline. They were speaking in low voices, occasionally looking toward my cabin. I recorded several minutes of video as they tested fishing spots, driving stakes into the ground to mark locations. I heard Richard say, "Tournament control tent will be here. Main competition area stretches from this point to the large boulder." They were on my property, planning their tournament as if the survey had never happened. Richard looked directly toward my cabin and smirked, clearly believing he was unobserved in the growing twilight. 2 more weeks of fines should do it. That cabin will be gone before we know it. I continued recording until they packed up their gear and departed. Then I emailed the video to Elena along with photos of the survey markers they had deliberately ignored. Her response came minutes later, perfect evidence. We'll file emergency injunction tomorrow. They are in for quite a surprise." As darkness fell over the lake, I thought about my grandfather and wondered if he had known all along what would happen. Had he kept quiet about the true extent of his property, knowing someday it might become my strongest defense? I remembered his favorite spot on the dock, where he would sit for hours with his fishing line in the water, watching the shoreline with a contented smile. "Patience is the virtue of a fisherman," he would tell me. "Sometimes you have to let them take the bait before you set the hook." The tournament was scheduled for this weekend. All the pieces were falling into place. After weeks of being the victim, I was about to change the game entirely. I pulled out my calendar and marked the date in red: Tournament Day. It was time to set the hook. The offices of Martinez and Associates occupied the entire third floor of a renovated brick building in the historic district. Elena's corner office offered a view of the town square, and in the distance, the sparkling waters of Pine Lake. I sat across from her desk as she methodically arranged the documents we had gathered: property deeds, survey results, photographs of harassment incidents, and video evidence of trespassing. "You have built quite the case," she said, adjusting her glasses. "The survey results alone would be enough to establish your ownership rights, but the documented pattern of harassment gives us additional leverage." She turned her computer monitor so I could see the screen. "Here is the cease and desist letter I have drafted. It addresses two separate issues. First, the HOA's harassment campaign regarding your cabin, and second, the unauthorized use of your property for community activities, including the fishing tournament." I leaned forward to read the formal legal language. The document was comprehensive, detailing every incident I had experienced and establishing the legal boundaries of my property with references to the official survey. "What happens next?" I asked. Elena leaned back in her chair. "Once this is delivered, they will likely contact their attorney immediately. Based on my experience with the Pine Lake HOA, they will initially attempt to dismiss our claims and may even threaten countersuits. However," she smiled confidently, "the documentary evidence is overwhelmingly in our favor. We are also filing for an emergency injunction regarding the tournament scheduled for this weekend." "Will that stop the tournament from happening?" She tapped her pen thoughtfully against the desk. "Not necessarily. The wheels of justice turn slowly, even with an emergency filing. The judge may not rule before the weekend." She paused, studying my expression. "But that might actually work to our advantage strategically." I nodded slowly, understanding her implication. If they proceed with the tournament on my property after receiving legal notice, they would be knowingly trespassing. "Exactly, and doing so in a very public, documented way." She gathered the papers into a folder. "I will have these delivered by courier this afternoon. The emergency injunction will be filed simultaneously." As I stood to leave, Elena handed me her card with her cell phone number handwritten on the back. "Call me anytime, day or night, if the situation escalates. Document everything, but do not engage directly with them if possible." Back at the cabin, I watched a courier's car pull into the community center parking lot, knowing the cease and desist letter was about to detonate in Karen Blackwell's hands. I did not have to wait long for the fallout. Less than 2 hours later, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Anderson, this is Jeffrey Walters, legal counsel for the Pine Lake Homeowners Association." The voice was smooth and practiced. "I have been asked to contact you regarding certain claims made in a letter received today." "I believe my attorney sent that letter," I replied. "Any response should be directed to her." "Yes, well, before we escalate this to a formal legal exchange, The board hoped we might clarify what appears to be a misunderstanding about property boundaries. His tone remained pleasant, but I could hear the tension underneath. The shoreline in question has been utilized by the community for over 20 years. That may be true, Mr. Walters, but usage does not establish ownership. The survey confirms the boundaries in the original deeds. A brief silence followed. The board is willing to discuss a reasonable accommodation regarding access rights. Perhaps a limited easement could be arranged. I am open to discussions after the pattern of harassment stops and my property rights are formally acknowledged, I said, repeating the phrase Alina had coached me to use. Harassment is a very serious allegation, Mr. Anderson. His voice cooled. The HOA has simply been enforcing established community standards. The anonymous threats and vandalism go well beyond community standards enforcement. I have documented everything. Another pause. I will convey your position to the board. In the meantime, regarding the fishing tournament this weekend. My position on the tournament is outlined in the cease and desist letter, I interrupted. Any use of my property without permission constitutes trespassing. After ending the call, I walked down to the shoreline to check on the survey markers. Several had been removed, but I had anticipated this and taken photos of their exact positions. As I was returning to the cabin, a neighbor I had never spoken to approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "I am Jennifer Miller. I live in the blue house 3 doors down." She glanced around nervously before continuing. "I wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with how the board is treating you." Surprised by this unexpected support, I introduced myself properly. "There was an emergency board meeting this afternoon," Jennifer continued. "Karen was absolutely livid. She and Richard are insisting the tournament will proceed as planned, regardless of your claims." "Did they discuss the property boundaries?" I asked. Jennifer nodded. "Richard claimed your survey must be incorrect, but Howard Mills, he is on the board too, suggested they check the county records themselves before proceeding. Karen shut him down immediately. She said they cannot show any weakness or uncertainty." "Thank you for telling me this," I said sincerely. "I should go before someone sees us talking." She turned to leave but paused. "For what it is worth, I liked your grandfather. He used to let my kids fish off his dock when they were little. Not everyone here is like Karen and Richard." The next morning, I awoke to the sound of hammering. From my bedroom window, I could see workers setting up canopies and signs along my shoreline. Large banners announcing the 10th annual Pine Lake Fishing Tournament were being strung between trees, my trees. I immediately began taking photos and video of the preparations, carefully documenting each trespasser and every structure being erected on my property. My phone rang just as I was making coffee. It was Alina. "The judge has reviewed our emergency filing," she said without preamble. "He is not stopping the tournament but has ordered a formal hearing for Monday morning. More importantly, he has directed that official notice be delivered to the HOA board regarding the disputed property lines." "They are already setting up on my shoreline," I told her. "Perfect. Document everything. This will strengthen our position on Monday." She paused. "Are you still planning to wait until the tournament is underway?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Maximum impact that way." "I will meet you at your cabin at noon tomorrow then. We will give them time to get fully invested in their event before we arrive." That evening, as sunset painted the lake in golden hues, I watched from my window as Karen Blackwell led a group of volunteers in placing the final decorations. News vans from local stations were parked in the community center lot, setting up equipment to cover what had apparently become a noteworthy regional event. A large banner near the judging tent proclaimed, "Sponsored by Pine Lake Luxury Homes, building a premier community." The irony was almost too perfect. They were proudly broadcasting their trespassing to the entire county. I noticed Richard Henderson giving an interview near the shoreline, gesturing expansively across what he believed was community property, but was actually my land. Every word, every gesture was being recorded not just by my camera, but by professional news crews. As darkness fell, I sat on my dock watching the final preparations. The tournament officials had set up floodlights that illuminated the shoreline, creating an inadvertent spotlight on their unauthorized use of my property. Tomorrow would change everything, but tonight I would enjoy one last evening of being underestimated. Tournament day dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring morning with just enough breeze to create gentle ripples on the lake's surface. From my kitchen window, I watched as anglers began arriving before sunrise, carrying expensive gear and setting up along my shoreline. By 8 o'clock, the area was transformed into a festival atmosphere with dozens of competitors, spectators, and officials crowding what everyone except me believed was community property. A temporary stage had been erected near the center of the shoreline, where Karen Blackwell stood in a white linen pantsuit, addressing the gathered crowd through a microphone. Even from a distance, I could hear her welcoming speech praising the community spirit and shared resources that made Pine Lake special. Behind her stood Richard Henderson in a fishing vest emblazoned with sponsor logos, beaming with pride as she introduced him as the tournament director. I spent the morning quietly observing and documenting, waiting for Alina to arrive. At precisely noon, her silver Audi pulled into my driveway. She emerged wearing a conservative navy blue suit, carrying a leather portfolio case. "Are you ready for this?" she asked as I met her on the porch. I nodded, feeling surprisingly calm, more than ready. I brought the certified survey maps and the property deed documentation, enlarged for display purposes. She opened her trunk and removed a portable easel and several mounted presentation boards. "The sheriff has been notified that we may need assistance, but hopefully that will not be necessary." We walked together down the path toward the tournament area. I carried the easel while Alina handled the documentation boards. As we approached the gathering, several people noticed us and fell silent, their expressions curious. We continued directly toward the judge's tent, where Richard Henderson was reviewing scorecards with several officials. "Excuse me," Alina said loudly, her professional voice cutting through the ambient noise. "I need to speak with the tournament director immediately." Richard looked up, recognition and then annoyance flashing across his face when he saw me. "We are in the middle of a tournament here. Whatever this is about will have to wait." Alina smiled coolly. "I am afraid it cannot wait, Mr. Henderson. I am Alina Martinez, legal counsel representing the property owner." She gestured toward me. "This entire shoreline where you are currently standing is private property belonging to my client. You are all trespassing." A hush fell over the nearest competitors and spectators. Richard's face reddened. "This is community property. It has been used for the tournament for years." "Actually, that is incorrect," Alina replied, setting up the easel. I handed her the first display board, a large copy of the original property deed with the boundaries clearly marked. "This is the original deed registered with the county in 1978, showing that this entire shoreline belongs to the Anderson property." By now, a crowd had gathered around us, including several tournament officials and board members. I spotted Karen Blackwell pushing her way through the onlookers, her face a mask of contained fury. "What is going on here?" she demanded. Alina turned to address her directly. Mrs. Blackwell, as president of the HOA, you received a cease and desist letter regarding unauthorized use of my client's property. Yet you proceeded with this event without permission or acknowledgement of his legal rights. This is absurd, Karen scoffed. This shoreline has been used by the community for decades. If there was ever a private claim, it has long been abandoned. Property rights do not expire through disuse, Alina countered, placing the second board on the easel. The official survey completed just days ago with the property lines clearly marked. This official survey confirms the boundaries established in the original deed. As you can see, the tournament is taking place entirely on private property. Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. I noticed several news cameras turning in our direction, drawn by the commotion. Richard stepped forward aggressively. This is a transparent attempt to disrupt our community event. Your client has been refusing to comply with HOA regulations. This is clearly retaliation. I cleared my throat, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. I have endured weeks of harassment from the HOA board. Anonymous threats, vandalism, impossible compliance deadlines, all designed to force me out of my home so developers could acquire my property. Karen laughed dismissively. Those are serious allegations with no evidence. Alina smiled thinly and placed the third board on the easel, a collection of photographs showing the removed survey markers, the threatening note, the egg vandalism, and most damaging of all, screenshots from the video of Richard and other board members trespassing and planning the tournament locations. We have extensive documentation of the harassment campaign, Alina stated, including this video of Mr. Henderson and other board members trespassing on my client's property while explicitly discussing how to force him out of his home. One of the tournament judges, an older man with a weathered face, stepped forward to examine the survey map more closely. These boundaries appear legitimate. If this is true, we are indeed on private property. Karen's composure finally cracked. This is outrageous. We will challenge this in court. The tournament will continue as planned. You are welcome to challenge the survey results, Alina replied calmly. However, continuing the tournament after being formally notified constitutes willful trespassing, which carries both civil and criminal penalties. A woman in the crowd called out, "Are you shutting down our tournament?" Several angry voices joined in support. I raised my hands for quiet. I have no desire to ruin anyone's day. The crowd settled somewhat, listening. I am not here to shut down your tournament. I am here because after weeks of being bullied and threatened by the HOA leadership, I need to establish that this property belongs to me and that the harassment must stop. I turned to address the wider audience. The tournament can continue today with my permission, which I freely give. All I ask is recognition of my property rights and an end to the campaign to force me out of my home. This announcement was met with surprised murmurs and a few scattered claps of approval. I noticed several homeowners looking at Karen and Richard with new expressions of doubt. However, I continued, meeting Karen's eyes directly, any future use of my shoreline will require formal agreements and reasonable accommodation for the impact on my property. One of the board members whispered urgently to Karen, who appeared torn between maintaining her authority and avoiding a public relations disaster with cameras rolling. Richard stood rigid with anger, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the judging table. Alina added smoothly, "My client is being extremely reasonable under the circumstances. Many property owners would demand immediate cessation of all activities and pursue damages for the unauthorized use." Karen finally found her political instincts. We will need to consult with our attorney before making any commitments. In the meantime, perhaps we can agree that the tournament may continue today while we resolve these misunderstandings. That is acceptable, I nodded. As I said, my issue is not with the community members who came to enjoy a day of fishing. My concern is with the systematic harassment and the deliberate misrepresentation of property boundaries by HOA leadership. A tournament official approached nervously. So we can continue the competition. Yes, I confirmed. Today only with my explicit permission. As word spread through the crowd that the tournament would continue, the immediate tension dissipated. Many participants returned to their fishing spots, though now with curious glances in my direction. However, a significant group remained gathered around the display boards, examining the evidence with growing concern. One homeowner confronted Karen directly. "Did you know about this property line issue when you were planning the tournament?" Before she could respond, Richard interjected angrily. "This is not the place to discuss HOA business. We will address all concerns at the next board meeting." "Actually," Alina said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "there will be a court hearing on Monday morning regarding these exact issues. Any interested community members are welcome to attend, as it is a matter of public record." As Alina and I prepared to leave, Jennifer Miller approached with several other homeowners. "We would like to know more about what has been happening," she said. "Perhaps we could meet somewhere to discuss this situation further." I nodded. My door is open to any neighbor who wants to have a respectful conversation. As we walked back toward my cabin, the sound of the tournament continued behind us, but something fundamental had changed. The power dynamic had shifted completely. From my porch, I could see small groups of homeowners gathered in intense discussion, many looking toward my cabin with new expressions of curiosity rather than disdain. Alina loaded her presentation materials back into her car. "That went even better than I expected," she said with satisfaction. "When bullies are exposed in public, their power evaporates quickly." I watched as Karen and Richard huddled with several board members in urgent conversation. Their body language told me everything I needed to know. They had lost control of the narrative and knew it. "What happens on Monday?" I asked. "The judge will likely issue a formal ruling on the property boundaries and address the harassment complaints," Alina explained. "But the court of public opinion has already rendered its verdict. Look around you." Throughout the afternoon, I observed the subtle but significant change in the atmosphere. Tournament participants now approached my property line respectfully, some even waving in acknowledgement. Several neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now offered tentative smiles or nods of greeting. By sunset, as the tournament concluded and the awards were presented in a notably subdued ceremony, I stood on my dock watching the community I had inherited along with my grandfather's cabin. This place that had felt so hostile just hours ago now seemed filled with possibility. Whatever happened next, the truth had been revealed, and that was the first step toward genuine change. The Pine Lake Community Center was filled beyond capacity for the emergency meeting called 3 days after the tournament. Extra chairs had been brought in to accommodate the unprecedented attendance, yet people still stood along the walls and in the doorway. The usual quiet deference that characterized HOA meetings had been replaced by a buzzing energy as neighbors spoke in small clusters, many turning to look as I entered and took a seat near the back. Karen Blackwell called the meeting to order with notably less confidence than usual. The entire board sat at the front table, their expressions somber. Richard Henderson was conspicuously absent. As you all know, Karen began, her voice slightly strained, we face a complicated situation regarding property boundaries along the North Shoreline. The board has consulted with legal counsel and reviewed the historic documentation. She paused, clearly struggling with what came next. It appears that the survey presented during the tournament is indeed accurate. The shoreline in question belongs to the Anderson property according to the original deeds. Our attorney has confirmed that the community does not have legal standing to challenge these boundaries. A murmur swept through the room. Karen raised her hand for quiet. The judge has issued a preliminary injunction prohibiting the HOA from continuing any enforcement actions regarding the Anderson property until a full hearing can be held regarding the harassment complaints. A man in the front row stood up. Is it true that board members were caught on video discussing how to force Alex out of his home? Karen glanced at the other board members before responding carefully. There were certain communications that, taken out of context, could be misinterpreted. That is not what I heard, another homeowner called out. My cousin works at the courthouse and said the video evidence is damning. Howard Mills, the thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had suggested checking the property records, cleared his throat. As treasurer of the board, I feel obligated to inform the community that we are facing potential legal liability for our actions regarding the Anderson property. Our insurance carrier has expressed concern about the documented pattern of harassment. This announcement triggered an outburst of angry questions from the audience. I sat quietly, observing the community dynamics shifting before my eyes. Longtime residents who had never spoken at meetings were standing up to question the board's actions. Newer homeowners looked shocked as the full story emerged through the discussion. After nearly an hour of increasingly heated exchanges, Jennifer Miller stood and addressed the room. I think we need to step back and consider what kind of community we want to be, she said, her voice clear and steady. Yes, property values matter. Yes, aesthetic standards have their place, but not at the expense of basic decency and respect for individual rights. What happened to Alex could happen to any of us if we fall out of favor with leadership. Her words resonated with many in the room, judging by the nodding heads and murmurs of agreement. I propose we form a committee to review the HOA covenant with an eye toward balancing community standards with reasonable accommodation for historic properties like the Anderson cabin, Jennifer continued. And I believe we need new leadership going forward. Karen's face paled as scattered applause broke out. Howard Mills adjusted his glasses and leaned toward the microphone. I believe Mrs. Miller has made a reasonable suggestion, he said. Additionally, I move that we immediately enter into good faith negotiations with Mr. Anderson regarding appropriate access to the shoreline for community events, with fair compensation for use of his property. The motion passed overwhelmingly, with only a handful of Karen's closest allies voting against it. As the meeting continued, I was approached by several neighbors I had never spoken to before, each offering tentative apologies or expressions of support. My kids love fishing off that shoreline, one father told me. We never realized it was private property. I hope we can work something out so they can still enjoy it. Your grandfather was a good neighbor, an elderly woman added. He always understood that sharing the lake was what made this community special. After the meeting, I stood in the parking lot talking with Jennifer and several other neighbors when Karen emerged from the building. She hesitated when she saw me, then straightened her shoulders and walked over. The board will be sending a formal apology for any misunderstandings, she said stiffly. Richard Henderson has resigned from his position, effective immediately. "Thank you for letting me know," I replied evenly. Karen looked as if she wanted to say more but instead gave a curt nod and walked to her car. As she drove away, Jennifer turned to me. "The election for new board members is next month," she said. "Things are going to change around here." Over the following weeks, a remarkable transformation took place in the Pine Lake community. A shoreline access agreement was negotiated that recognized my ownership while allowing controlled community use for specific events with proper notice and reasonable compensation. The harassment complaints were settled out of court when the HOA's insurance company insisted on avoiding a public trial. With the pressure of impossible renovation demands lifted, I was able to focus on making thoughtful improvements to my cabin. I repainted the exterior in a warm cedar tone, not because the HOA required it, but because I wanted to honor my grandfather's legacy while putting my own stamp on the place. I replaced the dock boards that had rotted, but kept the original design that extended over the crystal-clear water. When the next fishing tournament was held, it operated under a formal agreement with me as a co-sponsor rather than an adversary. The event drew an even larger crowd than before, with many participants expressing appreciation for the preserved natural shoreline that provided ideal fishing conditions. One sunny afternoon in late summer, I sat on my dock watching a family fishing from a spot along my shoreline, now properly marked with small, tasteful signs acknowledging private property with permitted access. The father was teaching his young daughter how to cast, his patient instructions carrying across the water. The scene reminded me so much of my grandfather that I felt a lump form in my throat. Howard Mills, who had been elected the new HOA president after Karen announced her decision to move to another community, walked down the path toward my dock. He carried a fishing rod and a small tackle box. "Beautiful day," he commented, stopping at a respectful distance. "I was wondering if the offer to fish off your dock is still open. My grandson is visiting next weekend, and I would love to teach him in a spot where he might actually catch something." "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the open space beside me. "My grandfather always said there is no better way to understand a lake than to fish it." Howard sat down carefully, setting his tackle box between us. "You know, your grandfather used to let me fish here years ago, before all the development changed things. He was generous that way." "I did not know that," I said, surprised. Howard nodded, gazing out over the water. Pine Lake was different then, simpler. When the developers came in and the HOA formed, priorities shifted. Property values became more important than people. He sighed. "Some of us forgot what made this place special in the first place." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the water, I thought about the journey of the past few months. What had started as an inheritance of a simple cabin had become something much more valuable, a reclaiming of my grandfather's legacy, and the creation of a new relationship with the community he had long been part of. The cabin still stood out among the luxury homes surrounding it, but now it represented something different to the community. Rather than an eyesore to be eliminated, it had become a reminder of Pine Lake's history and the importance of respecting individual rights while finding common ground. The weathered logs and simple structure told a story of resilience that resonated beyond property lines. From my dock, I could see neighbors walking along the shoreline path that now officially crossed my property through a proper easement agreement. They waved as they passed, no longer strangers but people I knew by name. My grandfather's cabin had found its place in the modern Pine Lake community, not by conforming to arbitrary standards, but by standing firm in its authentic character. As twilight settled over the water, I thought of my grandfather's favorite saying about patience being the virtue of a fisherman. He had been right. but not just about fishing. Patience, principle, and persistence had transformed a hostile situation into a new beginning. The shoreline that had been the source of conflict had become the foundation for a more balanced community, one where differences were respected and no one stood alone.